Ludendorff looked at the map at Avesnes on 26th of March 1918 and, for the first time in the war, refused to follow his own success. The Fifth Army was broken. The Somme crossings were taken. Every instinct he had ever trusted told him to widen the front, to strike at Arras, where the British seemed to waver, to gather up whatever the collapsing line offered. He did not. He drew a line to Amiens and told his army commanders that nothing else existed. 5 days earlier, at 4:40 in the morning of 21st of March, Georg Bruchmüller's guns had opened a 5-hour hurricane bombardment across 40 miles of front between Arras and La Fère. Behind it came stormtroops trained to bypass strongpoints and drive into the empty spaces behind them. It worked. Sir Hubert Gough's Fifth Army, holding the thin southern sector taken over from the French, gave way faster than anyone on either side had imagined possible. Gough would be relieved before the month was out and replaced by Rawlinson, a scapegoat for a disaster that was structural rather than personal. The German advantage was real, and it was borrowed. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, signed on 3 March, had released roughly 50 divisions from the east. But American troops were landing in France at an accelerating rate. Some 300,000 already, hundreds of thousands more promised by summer. Ludendorff had perhaps 4 months of numerical superiority and no fifth. Every officer in that room knew it. In this alternate timeline exploration, we examine what could have happened and why the real history unfolded differently. What Ludendorff decided in that room was, in our history, the opposite of what he decided, and the reason he chose otherwise would eventually be understood as the single most consequential failure of imagination in the war. Amiens was not a city. It was a junction. The British lateral railway, the artery that let Haig shift divisions north and south along his own front, met the main trunk line running south to Paris in the marshalling yards there. Cut it, and the two Allied armies could no longer reinforce one another by rail. They would remain in contact only in the sense that two men standing on opposite banks of a river remain in contact. Hutier's 18th Army carried the southern flank with the infiltration methods that bore his name. Maurice pressed the center. They closed on the Havre and the Luce in the last days of March, and where in our history the German advance faltered short of Villers-Bretonneux and was thrown back, here it did not falter because Ludendorff sent no divisions to Arras and launched no subsidiary Mars attack on 28th March. Villers-Bretonneux fell in the first days of April and stayed fallen. From the ridge behind it, German guns ranged onto the Amiens yards. They did not need to take the city. They needed only to make it useless. The trunk line south went silent in the second week of April. Trains that had run to Paris in 5 hours now went by way of Rouen or did not go at all. An army is a habit of mind before it is a body of men. Deprived of the rail that had bound them, Haig and Pétain each obeyed the instinct he had held privately for 4 years. Haig's overriding anxiety had always been the Channel ports. Boulogne, Calais, Dunkirk, his line of retreat, his line of supply, the road home. He bent northwest. Pétain's overriding anxiety had always been Paris, which was not merely a capital, but the political survival of France. He bent southwest. Neither man betrayed the other, each simply covered what he could not lose, and the ground between them widened by 10 miles a week. Ferdinand Foch had been made coordinator of Allied forces at Doullens on 26 March, the same day, by the accident of the calendar, that Ludendorff was fixing his single objective at Avesnes. In April, he was formalized as Generalissimo. He had authority now, and it had arrived precisely 1 week too late to be exercised over a rupture that no authority could close. The gap was filled with cavalry screens and improvised detachments, dismounted troopers, cyclists, engineers with rifles. A curtain, not a wall. The consequences of this would prove catastrophic. But first we need to understand what Ludendorff did next, because the whole shape of the summer turned on his refusing, a second time, to be tempted. He held to the plan. This was the thing no one who knew him had expected, and it was worth more than any division. In our history, the Lys offensive, Operation Georgette, was a new attack in a new sector against an enemy who had been given 3 weeks to prepare. Here it was not an offensive at all. It was a pursuit. Ludendorff followed the British as they went northwest, keeping his weight on their retreating flank rather than opening fresh ground. And the difference between attacking a prepared line and leaning on a retreating one is the difference between a battle and an unraveling. There was no miracle weapon in this. The German army had no mechanized means of exploitation. Its supply columns still moved at the pace of horses and men, dragging shells across the churned wreckage of the old Somme battlefield. And there were days when the advance stopped, simply because the guns could not come forward. What had changed was not capability. It was direction. Every ton that would have gone to Arras went instead to the one place where a ton mattered. Heysbruck fell. The Flanders railheads went with it by early summer. The British were not destroyed. They were pushed into a shrinking coastal pocket with their backs to the sea, and their supply arriving over 3 ports that German aircraft could see from the ground. David Lloyd George governed at the head of a coalition that depended on conservative support, and he had spent the spring insisting to the House of Commons that the British Army in France was stronger in January 1918 than it had been a year before. On the 9th of May, he rose to answer the charge that this was false. In our history, he won that division comfortably, and the affair became a footnote. Here he rose to answer it with the Channel ports under artillery observation and the casualty lists arriving in the newspapers faster than the government could summarize them. The figures were the same figures. The front behind them was visibly folding. He won. That is the thing to understand about the Maurice debate in this timeline. He won the division. The margin was 51, and a margin of 51 is not a victory, but a receipt handed to the conservative leadership, showing exactly what the coalition was still worth. They read it carefully. They did not act in May. They acted later and quietly, and the manner of it was never debated in the chamber at all. Pétain had never been a defeatist, whatever was said of him afterward. He was an arithmetician. By June, the German guns could reach toward the outer Paris rail belt. The British could no longer reinforce him by any route that existed, and his own reserves had been spent holding a flank that no longer had a neighbor. He proposed a defensive line covering the capital and nothing beyond it. Not surrender, not even armistice. A line and the acknowledgement that France could not hold what she could not reach. Georges Clemenceau had been premier since November 1917 and had staked his ministry, his reputation, and his considerable capacity for hatred on the proposition that France would continue the war to victory. He held the chamber for a month. He held it through the loss of the Wise line, and through the first Bern rumors, and through a session in which he spoke for 2 hours without notes. Then he lost it. Not to an argument. To arithmetic, the same arithmetic Pétain had done, arrived at independently by 300 deputies who could count divisions and could count the distance from the German batteries to the Gare du Nord. The vote was taken on a Thursday, and then came the moment that would define everything that followed. The French government authorized conversations through neutral Bern on terms. The American divisions kept landing. They came into Saint-Nazaire and Bordeaux at exactly the rate the shipping tables had promised, because shipping tables do not read newspapers. Pershing had spent a year resisting the amalgamation of his divisions into British and French formations, insisting on an independent American army under American command, and he had won that argument. He had his army. It was arriving in the strength he had demanded, on the schedule he had demanded, into a country whose government was exchanging notes through a Swiss intermediary and whose army was digging. There is no dishonor in what happened to those men. They marched inland past French troops, improving trenches nobody expected to attack from. They trained. They waited for an offensive that no French government could now authorize and no British army could now support. Pershing, who had been unmovable on the question of independence, discovered that independence is only meaningful when there is something to be independent for. He had built an instrument. The war it had been built for had ended around it, without him, while it was still in transit. The settlement was made in pieces, in the way that separate pieces always are, and no photograph was taken of the signing. Germany kept Brest-Litovsk. The Eastern Empire the treaty had drawn in March remained on the map. The Baltic provinces, Ukraine, the vast granary of the East. In the west, the frontier was rectified, a strip of French territory here, a coalfield there, an arrangement over Belgium, ambiguous enough that both sides could describe it to their own parliaments as a success. Woodrow Wilson's terms, the 14 points, were offered to a Europe that had already settled with itself. They were received politely, they were not needed, and the German army came home undefeated in the field. That is the sentence to sit with, not the treaty, not the frontier, not the loss of Amiens. 4 million men marched back across the Rhine, having never been beaten, into a country that had starved for 4 years to give them the victory they were now bringing home. An army that has not been broken does not learn what a broken army learns. It goes home believing what it did was sufficient, and it goes home believing it could be done again. None of it was inevitable. Ludendorff might have widened the front, as he did in our world, and lost his army in the widening. Foch might have been given his authority a week earlier. Haig and Pétain might have been bound by something stronger than a railway. The Allied victory that actually came was not luck. It was won at Villers-Bretonneux and on the Marne and in the 100 Days by men who held ground that could have been given up. But it turned at one point on one man in one room, choosing between his instinct and his map. He chose his instinct. He widened the front. He lost. The other Ludendorff, the one who looked at the map at Avesnes and saw only Amiens, won a war and brought home an army that had never learned the one thing an army most needs to know.